and welcome to Talking Aussie Books, a weekly podcast bringing readers and writers of Australian fiction together. I'm Claudine Tonellis. As an avid reader and passionate advocate for Australian fiction, I have made it my mission to spotlight local talent. So if you're looking for your next read or simply want to learn more about the Australian literary scene, this podcast is for you. Grab yourself a cuppa, sit back and relax. This episode is brought to you by HarperCollins Australia. Many years ago, listeners, I picked up a book by international global best-selling author Robert Ludlum called The Bourne Identity. It's a book about a man with incredible survival skills, suffering amnesia, who then goes on a quest to uncover his true identity and in the process must also find out why people are trying to kill him, including the CIA. In reading this book, I discovered that I loved the heart-racing pace, gritty action and tension of this kind of story. A man on the run, dodging the people trying to kill him, but using his smarts and assassin-like skills and manages to stay alive. Obviously, since that book, there have been many similar attempts at creating a Bourne-like character. And with all due respect to the many Ludlum and Bourne fans out there, but none quite like Aussie ex-cop Jack Carlin in the new, absolutely electrifying, action-packed thriller by award-winning author and playwright Gabriel Bergmoser. High Rise, published by HarperCollins at the end of July, is nothing like anything I've read before. Thrilling, tense, action-filled, and packing an emotional punch. I couldn't have loved this book more. And in fact, I intend to go back and reread the many passages and lines I'd marked on my first read-through to relive the highs and lows of this incredibly entertaining story and to spend a bit more time with Jack and his daughter Morgan. But before I do that, I'm excited to have the chance to speak with their creator on the podcast today. So welcome, Gabriel, and congratulations on this brilliant novel.
Thank you so much for having me, Claudine. And that's extremely high praise to start with. So, I'm feeling a little bit embarrassed right now, but also extremely flattered. So it's a nice combination.
Oh, don't be embarrassed. I think it's absolutely well deserved.
Oh, thank you so much. I mean, it was such a coming into writing this book, my first major thriller, The Hunted with HarperCollins back in 2020. The Hunted was kind of an action horror, I guess you could say. It was an outback kind of extreme siege story set in a roadhouse in the middle of nowhere. And I really sort of enjoyed writing something that was so high octane, so intense, taking place over one night. But since then, I've kind of been writing a lot more in the sphere of slow burn suspense in my books, The Caretaker and The Hitchhiker in particular. And while I'd really, really enjoyed that with High Rise, I wanted to go back to, I guess, the action realm, but in a much purer way, in a way that isn't infused with the same sort of blood-soaked extreme horror of The Hunted. But there's still quite a bit of blood soaking the many floors of the High Rise building, but in a way that was a lot more just very, very simple, very straightforward. Father and daughter are on the top floor of this building. There is a reward on the father's head. The daughter's in trouble with the police. Every criminal in Melbourne is converging on the building. The police will probably turn up at some point. How the hell do they get out of here? And it was really just like with that intense, really simple, really straightforward elevator pitch that let me just kind of, almost like, those cars that you pull back, those toy cars when you're a kid and you pull them back and just let them go and just see where they end up. That was what the process of writing this was like, just kind of absolutely unleashing it, and it was a complete ball from start to finish. So to hear that the action and the thrills of it are kind of resonating is very, very gratifying to hear after all the work that's gone into it.
I'm sure. Now, Jack Carlin we talked a little bit about this before we started recording, but Jack Carlin is a returning character in your world. He appears in a couple of your previous novels, The Inheritance and 2 Audible originals and a Lockdown Project. And Morgan, his daughter, was not exactly a new character either. But I wondered if you could tell us how you came to decide to put them in this new novel together.
Okay, so this is the really interesting part. The gestation of this book is so unique, and I feel like even saying that is a bit of a falsity because the gestation of every book is unique. So I don't want to sort of pretend that this was any more so, except it kind of was in a lot of ways because its origins really sort of date back to COVID. And they date back to COVID in the sense that during lockdown, I had just had The Hunted come out, or The Hunted was just about to come out, and I was working on The Inheritance, which was the follow-up to The Hunted. Now, The Hunted and The Inheritance follow Maggie, this berserker vigilante character, and in The Inheritance, I introduced the character of Jack Carlin as this sort of ultimately ally to her, but initially his motivations are a bit more ambiguous. And Jack Carlin is one of those characters that you get every now and then in your career, where the moment you start writing him, he just takes over and he just says what he says, and his voice is so clear and his motivations are so clear, and he just kind of felt completely himself without me having to really work that much on him. I really enjoyed writing him. But during COVID, I was simultaneously working on this different project, which had kind of come up last minute, which was the idea of doing a web series as a project to kind of keep me and a lot of my creative friends busy during lockdown. I, at the time, was part of a theatre company. We'd had our 2020 and 2021 seasons completely scuppered by COVID. And so we decided to pivot and sort of take a lot of the talented creatives we knew, writers, directors, actors, and make this web series and make it in a format that could reward the only format that was really available to us, which was the format of Zoom calls. Now, we didn't want to do it in a way that was COVID dependent. We wanted it to be a story that could work either in the setting of COVID or outside of it. And so the premise I came up with was the idea of this girl with a troubled past, Morgan Carlin, who's living in Germany, and she finds out that her ex-boyfriend Brett has gone missing, and she suspects that his disappearance is to do with a secret that they both share that she's been sitting on for a very, very long time. So this kind of forced her into a situation where from Germany, she starts video calling all the people from her past who may or may not know something about the disappearance and trying to find out basically from them what might have happened to Brett while not giving away her own dark secrets at the same time. So in my mind, this was just a fun kind of diversion during COVID. But as we developed and we wrote the series, it grew and it expanded and I discovered new things. And one thing that I did at the time was I thought, wouldn't it be cool if Morgan was the daughter of Jack Carlin, this character from The Inheritance? And so as I was writing both projects simultaneously, I sort of put references to each in the other one, but they kind of became very informative of each other because what I learnt about Morgan in The Pact, the web series project, informed what I wrote about Jack in The Inheritance and vice versa. And it was a really sort of fun way to approach character development. And then on top of that, of course, you have all the work of the actors involved, most particularly Rose Flanagan, who played Morgan in all 14 episodes of the web series, really giving you this whole new sense of a character that you've created and taking that character and enriching that character beyond what you've put on the page. So, by the time COVID was done, we weren't going to continue doing the Pact or anything because it wasn't a particularly fun way to make a project and everything. And I sort of felt like that story was in some ways left up in the air. And while Jack went on to appear in my other books, I always felt like I left Morgan's story kind of parked, and I didn't fully get to resolve what she was going through and her struggles with addiction and her struggles with criminality and her struggles most pertinently with guilt. And so fast forward to 2023 when I'm asked by HarperCollins what book ideas I've got coming up in the future. And this idea cohered almost instantly, where I just thought, what if Jack and Morgan, who we've established in all these other projects as having had this incredibly contentious relationship, are forced into a scenario where they're at the top of this building, Jack's tracked her down, he's tried to help her, she doesn't want his help, and then basically they find out at the same time this reward's been put on Jack's head, the criminal underworld's after them, they have to work together to get out. And while, the Pact was a mystery done through Zoom calls and, the Inheritance was not even Jack Carlin's story or anything, having done all that work previously on both of these characters meant that I knew them both extremely intimately. And so straight away, the idea of forcing them into this action thriller scenario, into this, Dread or Die Hard or the Raid situation. And it's through this scenario that they're forced to deal with their problems and deal with their demons and deal with their past relationship. I mean, that to me as a writer was irresistible. So finding a way to kind of tell this action story that is actually at its heart a story of a father and a daughter learning to understand each other, and in the process resolving these storylines that have kind of been sort of in my writing universe since 2020 was just one of the most satisfying things I've ever gotten to do.
Indeed. My God, there's so much in there. And I love that you took the opportunity to build on a project that was started during lockdown. And in fact, I love that you gave them their own story. You've told this story from two first-person points of view. So you've got Jack and Morgan's, and you've done it in alternating chapters. And as you've said, Morgan is hiding from her father, essentially blaming him and herself for the turn that her life has taken. She wants nothing to do with this man, but she's just been released from prison and has in fact turned to a life of petty crime to survive. Her father, on the other hand, is doing everything he can to locate Morgan, to save her from herself in many ways. And it's a completely fractured relationship, but one that's held together by Jack's fierce love for his daughter. And as you said, at its heart, it's a father-daughter story. I know this story had its genesis in the Pact, but how did you get inside their heads? Because it was so revelatory.
Thank you for that, because it wasn't easy. Like, it truly wasn't easy. And when I say that, I mean, I'd written Jack Carlin before, obviously in several books, and also I'd written one Audible original, The Consequence, in which he was the protagonist. So his voice was very, very clear to me. But the case of Morgan, the truth of it is, and I think I say this in the acknowledgements of the book, I'd always felt that Morgan was, while I'd created her and I'd come up with what her situation was and what her backstory was and everything, I felt like the personality traits and the character traits of hers that made her so distinct in the pact had really come more from Rose Flanagan, the actor, and from Pete Blackburn, the director. I mean, they'd come up with a lot of ideas for Morgan's backstory, a lot of ideas for what drove her, and that comes through in Rose's, really still fantastic performance in the pact. I mean, the pact is a rough lockdown project, and it suffers from some problems that come with that, but Rose was always so good. And so when it came to writing this book, I thought, I really want to do it in first person. I really want to do it in first person between two perspectives where we almost get the Rashomon of Jack's point of view versus Morgan's point of view on similar events and similar issues. And while in some respects they're both right and they're both wrong in all of their conflicts, and to me that created a lot of really compelling drama. But I felt like Morgan was at a disadvantage because I simply didn't know the character as well as I knew Jack. I just hadn't written her as much as I'd written Jack. I'd only ever written her in a screenplay format that had then been filled in by actors and directors. So honestly, I consulted with Rose. I went to Rose. I said, look, you worked so hard on this character during lockdown. I really want to honor the work that you did in this project that meant so much to us and kept us all sane during lockdown. Obviously, High Rise was never going to be the Pact 2. You don't need to have, seen this sort of little lockdown web series from 2020 or ever read any of my earlier books for it. But I didn't want to contradict the pact. I didn't want to throw the pact out, and I didn't want to ignore any of what Rose had brought to the character. And that actually ended up being this incredible resource because it was Rose who suggested the thing that really cohered Morgan's voice and Morgan's character for me, because she's got this past of criminality. She's done something quite awful in the past. And a lot of the pact is her avoiding having to face up to that. So I said to Rose, look, I'm doing this a few years later. I'm setting this story a bit further on from the events of the web series and anything else because I don't want to have to rely too heavily on what was in that. And I don't want to have to, I want it to be its own thing. But one thing is I go, we know that Morgan's done something really awful. How do I make her a likable or empathetic character without having had her turn herself in, without having had her face the music for what she's done? And Rose thought about it for all of 5 seconds. And then she said to me, what if Morgan has? And I said, what do you mean? And Rose says, what if she has turned herself in? What if she has faced the music for what she's done? What if she has decided to accept responsibility for her past mistakes and nobody has forgiven her? She's gone to prison. She's done her time. She has done everything she could possibly do to deal with this situation, which, as you'll learn in the book, may or may not have been her fault. And even after all of that, it just hasn't been enough. Her friends have shunned her family shunned her, and the only person who has the time of day for her is the father who she hates. And Rose suggested that, and straight away I just thought, oh my God, what a place to start. What a place to start for a character. What if you are somebody who, in the midst of addiction, has done something terrible and you've tried everything in your power to make amends for it, and it just hasn't been enough? What do you do? Truly, what do you do with your life then? What's the point of staying sober? What's the point of staying on the straight and narrow? What's the point of staying away from criminality? And, that to me was so rich and so compelling. Her voice just immediately took shape around that idea. And it gave the book this heart and this soul that made it more than just an action novel. It made it more than just a sort of all-night bruising exercise in as much close quarters brutality as I could come up with, which of course it is as well at the same time. But by having this idea, to me, it just it made my heart ache for both of them, because Jack Carlin has also done bad things in his past as a dodgy cop, and he's trying to make amends as well. And the idea of these two characters who are trying to make amends in different ways, and Jack knows that he can help Morgan, but Morgan doesn't want his help. But at the same time, she's grappling with what Jack was once grappling with as well, and he understands her. And if they would just listen to each other, if they would just actually come to the table and give each other the grace to admit that, we're both human and we can hear and we can help each other, then so many of their problems would be solved. But unfortunately, it takes a building teeming with hundreds of machete and axe wielding enemies to get them to that place, as it does with so many of our fractured family relationships. I think it's actually an incredibly relatable story. So yeah, that really is where the voice of Morgan kind of came from, and the way in which these two voices play off each other. And I will say as well, a little sneaky plug here, one of the really, really cool things about this process of the book being released and everything is that Rose actually narrates the Morgan chapters of the audiobook. So Rose Flanagan actually comes back from the web series and reprises her role in the Morgan chapters of the audiobook. And I've been listening to it, and it's just so cool. She's just so good. So, I mean, I would highly, highly recommend checking out High Rise as an audiobook if you want to get that experience because it's so cool.
You've touched on a couple of things in your answer previously that I want to sort of just pick up. Morgan, as you say, is suffering from guilt of something that she's done in the past, something that she's shouldering the blame for and trying to seek forgiveness or absolution for. And Jack, as you said, is someone who's not exactly had a very clean past. He wants to kind of fast track Morgan's understanding that absolution probably will never come. And he kind of does everything he can to soften her fall, to try and protect her. But I think he comes to realize that even though as a parent that's instinct and is an expression of love for his child, it doesn't exactly do her any favors, right?
Absolutely. I mean, it's that fascinating question, isn't it? Of like I always think about the Cat Stevens song Father and Son, right? And how Cat Stevens used to always say that he understood both points of view of that song. And there's a one point of view in that song, the father's point of view, of course, that only comes with age. Now, I'm not a parent myself, so it's not like I'm saying, oh, I suddenly understand my parents so much more for that reason. But just as I get older and as the situations that I get into these days, or like it might be a conflict with somebody or an argument with somebody or whatever, I find that I handle these things so much differently to how I would have 10 years ago because I see things differently. I'm more willing to sort of look at things from somebody else's perspective. I'm less liable to immediately take a position of defensiveness anytime I'm criticized about anything. And, these I think are good things. And these are things that adults said to me when I was younger about these are the better ways to handle difficult situations in your life. And of course, I didn't listen. And even if I understood intellectually the correctness of that point of view when I was younger, I didn't listen because I didn't know enough at that point. I hadn't experienced it myself. And so, I mean, in the case of High Rise, what we're seeing is that case of, I guess, cumulative understanding supercharged through, deep and abiding and a horrible gnawing guilt. But it is that thing of basically the story of the parent having said to the child, this is what you need to do, and I understand this and everything, and the child actually having to go through the crucible themselves in order to understand that point of view. And I think that that's a really human thing. I think that's a really, really human thing that, like, everybody who either is a parent or who has younger people in their lives who they want to advise and guide has to at some point accept that you can't shield them from the world and you can't fast track their decision making processes. You can't fast track their lesson learning processes because we all have to make stupid mistakes ourselves in order to learn those hard lessons. Because until we've made those mistakes, we don't understand the value of the lessons. Until we've actually made those mistakes and seen the consequences, we can't understand why an older, ostensibly wiser adult might be telling us this thing. And I think that's really what's going on at the heart of Jack and Morgan. And I mean, that's not to absolve Jack because, Jack hasn't been a great father. He's been distant, he's been absent, he's been manipulative. And, I don't want to say that he's this paragon of wisdom. He owns himself in the book that he wasn't, and he's made mistakes. But I think what counts is that he's trying to make amends now. And, I don't think that most human beings should be defined by the mistakes they've made. I think they should be defined by how they try to amend those mistakes. And that's very much what I think both of these characters are facing in this book.
Absolutely. So well said. Gabe, the bulk of this story happens inside this 15-story crumbling Melbourne high-rise building, which is occupied by junkies, outlaws, people hiding out from authorities, and, of course, Morgan. And it's where Jack finds her when the bounty hunters are unleashed. Now, I can think of a couple of places in Sydney where this might actually be set, but did you have an area or a building in mind when you decided to start writing this, or is it complete fiction?
Yeah, look, I used to live in this extremely dodgy apartment in North Melbourne that was like above an extremely dodgy supermarket in an extremely dodgy district. And it was near like a really old commission flat, like a really dilapidated, rundown, neglected commission flat that I think I got told at some point it had been a commission flat, but it wasn't anymore. And it was just this building that nobody was really overlooking anymore. And originally I thought about setting this story in a commission flat, but then the point was made to me that actually there's a lot of oversight in commission flats. There's a lot of checking in, there's a lot of caretaking to make sure that, everything's up to date, the facilities are as good as they can be and everything. And of course, there's always going to be budgetary constraints and everything. And I'm not saying, they're perfectly managed or anything like that. But the idea of this building that's been kind of forgotten by the government, forgotten by the law, sort of left to its own devices, that's probably a slightly maybe more than slightly heightened and not necessarily credible premise. But I don't think you have to stretch that much to imagine that that could be the case, that this place is sort of left and abandoned. And it little touches like the fact that a lot of commission flats don't have balconies. They don't have windows you can fully open and things like that. I mean, that really helped my cause in terms of making the building as claustrophobic and contained as possible. So I was thinking about that building that I used to live near. That's kind of what I had in my mind the whole time I was writing this. And then, of course, you make some slight adjustments to geography and some slight adjustments to layout and everything, to essentially serve your purposes from a storytelling perspective, because ultimately you need to figure out how to have all these action scenes in there, and you might just have to fudge the realistic layouts just a little bit to make that work.
Talking about the action scenes, the action moves between the different floors of the building, and there's a lot of action in the stairwells and the lift shafts and the like. So it got me wondering about the staging of all this action and the number of bodies that inevitably pile up as Jack and Morgan try and fight their way out of the building. At every turn, no sooner do they overcome one obstacle than they face another. So I was wondering, Gabe, how do you keep track of everything? Do you meticulously plan out all these scenes in advance, or do they just evolve while you're writing?
It's funny you ask that, because this is probably the first book that I've ever written that I made up completely as I went along. And that wasn't by design. That's the only way that I can own this, because it truly wasn't by design. I signed the contract for High Rise. I started trying to plan it, because normally what I do, I don't plan too heavily. I normally just write a 1 or 2 page outline or a rough chapter breakdown that's always got the flexibility to change later on, because you always want to be able to pivot if a character surprises you or a storyline goes away you don't expect. I don't believe that writers do themselves any favors by writing a rigid plan that they can't change later on. The more meticulous and detailed the plan is, the harder it is to shift from it. But in this case, there wasn't a detailed or meticulous plan. There wasn't even a rough plan. There was no plan, because I couldn't figure it out. I spent day after day after day wandering around St. Kilda with my long-suffering cavoodles, just trying to completely, break down in my head how this book would work and what would happen chapter by chapter. And I just couldn't see it. And then finally, in a moment of frustration, I thought, I'm just going to start writing it. And I did. And the moment I wrote the first chapter, I just saw the next one. And I was like, oh, okay, that's what happens next. It was like walking in a forest with a torch held just in front of you. And you can only see a certain way. But once you've gone that first stretch of the path, you can see the next stretch, but you can't see beyond that. And that was how I wrote the book, because suddenly I knew what the next chapter was going to be. So I was like, all right. And then I went on and I went on and I went on, and I saw more of the path and more of the path and more of the path. And then you get to about halfway through the book and you go, is this path leading me off a cliff or not? Because I had tried once in the past to write a book that I sort of just made up as I went, and I got hopelessly and terribly lost. And I ended up having to scrap most of it because it just wasn't going to work. But in this case, it just seemed to keep working. And it was eventually my publisher, Catherine Milne, when I confessed that to her, who said, well, yeah, it makes perfect sense, because this book has a very clear objective: get them out of the building. And it's got a very clear starting point there at the top of the building. And between the top and the bottom, the main thing you have to do is throw as many obstacles at the characters as possible, and then try to figure out, as the characters would have to, how they're going to get out of this. They're in the stairwell and they clatter into the stairwell and they see the bad guys rushing up the stairwell a few stories below them. Well, what do they do? And I remember in that moment thinking, I don't know what to do. And then I thought, well, hang on, those stairwells have fire extinguishers. So I have Morgan grab the fire extinguisher and blast it down and fill the stairwell with whatever it is, the vapor, the powder or anything, so that nobody can see anything. So nobody knows what floor they've run onto and nobody knows where they're hiding. And that was the kind of almost real-time problem solving I had to work through as I wrote the book. And so I said this recently to somebody else, but it was almost like I was playing chess against myself, because I'd be like, all right, now they're on this floor. Now I'm going to throw 5 armed bikers at Jack, and he's stuck there and he doesn't have a weapon or whatever it might be. And then I had to figure out, sort of as the character would, how he'd get out of it. And it's not a way of writing I particularly recommend, and it's not a way of writing that I particularly want to do ever again. But for one reason or another, it's the only way of writing that seemed to work for this book. So that's what it was. Yeah, no planning at all.
So not only have you got them effectively locked in a building, trying to get out, trying to make their way down 15 flights, and you're throwing all these obstacles at them, but you've kind of got a ticking time bomb happening with the bounty hunters trying to grab him. And you've also constrained all of the action to under 12 hours. So was that something that you were conscious of while you were writing?
I think there's a lot to be said for the pressure cooker idea. And The Hunted had a little bit of this when I wrote that. I mean, that's a siege in an outback roadhouse that takes place overnight. And with The Hunted, obviously for the bad guys, it's like, all right, it's a middle of nowhere roadhouse, but by the time dawn comes, there are going to be cars back on this road. You know, there are going to be people driving past. This has to be done by dawn. In the case of High Rise, that time constraint isn't as explicit, but there's a very different constraint going on in High Rise, which is that I've made sure the building is an urban building. And so the big risk in High Rise is that no one can use a gun. Like bad guys and good guys alike, no one can use a gun because Jack doesn't want the police to find Morgan, and the bad guys obviously don't want the police to raid the building. And it's set in Australia, so gunshots are not a normal thing to hear. So the moment somebody fires a gun in the building, and because there are innocent people living in this building as well, somebody's calling the cops and there will be a raid and they will surround the building and that will be that, you know? So in at least the first half of the book, a lot of the tension I think comes from the fact that everybody involved has to be as stealthy as possible. And Jack has a gun, but he can't use it. And that was kind of fun because I was thinking, all right, well, he's armed, but he can't shoot anyone. And so for a lot of the first two-thirds of the book, the weapons are all handheld weapons. And yeah, there is a point where the weapons take a turn for the ridiculous. There may or may not be a flamethrower, you know, who can confirm or deny these things. But it did add this like interesting layer of tension. And of course it's Chekhov's reverberating gunshot sound in some ways, where you just know that the moment somebody pulls a trigger at some point, the police will be there very, very quickly. And then the stakes become something very different, because then it's not just we have to get past all of these bad guys in the halls. Then it's there is a ring of cops surrounding the building on the outside. Now we somehow have to get past them as well. Or alternatively, we have to get through before they raid the building, or while they're raiding the building. So what does that look like? And you know, Jack and Morgan are the good guys in this situation. You know, they can take out a bunch of bounty hunters out to kill them easily enough, but they're not going to do that to cops. So what happens then? You know, but Morgan's still a wanted criminal. So it just you know tightened the screws for the characters bit by bit by bit by bit. So the time limit thing isn't so explicit, but the gunshot limit thing I think is, and adds a very different element to it.
Now, we've mentioned a couple of times that Jack is an ex-cop, and he's kind of, you know, an ex-cop turned vigilante. And that doesn't exactly endear him to his former colleagues. But what I want to talk about is not so much this fall from grace of police officers, but the often sort of difficult moral ground that police traverse in trying to carry out their jobs, and the cynicism of many who join because they want to help and then find out that perhaps the world is not what they thought it was. And there was one line in this book that I underlined with 3 lines. Such was its impact to me. And it's around at the 3/4 mark when Jack is contemplating that he might very well die in this high-rise building. And he observes that while sometimes death is random, most of the time it isn't. And he says, and if I may quote, "Our lives are the expression of choices we've made. It only stands to reason our deaths are as well." And I absolutely loved that line. But I wondered if you could sort of explain to listeners what Jack meant by that.
Yeah, so I mean, it's a funny one because look, we've all encountered death that is random and unfair. You know, people we know who die in car accidents, people we know who die of cancer and they've never had a cigarette in their lives and everything, and that does happen. But the truth of it is, and I, you know, without going too far into dark territories or anything here, it's like I've known people in my life who have gone down dark roads and who have, you know, fallen into crime and addiction and things like that. And ultimately, you know, I wouldn't be so harsh as to say that, oh, you know, well, you went down that road, so therefore that's it. But it is a matter of like you have made certain choices that have put you on certain paths, and there is a really sad almost inevitability sometimes to when you get the phone call saying that this person has passed away in a manner that you can draw the clear line from A to B to. And it was something that sort of occurred to me as I wrote this book. And I'm not saying that it's entirely my worldview. I don't think I'm that absolutist in any way, shape, or form, but it felt like a worldview that Jack would share, particularly with him having seen so much of the worst of humanity and with him existing in this world of criminality. And with Jack, I mean, he's a cop who, when he was a young rookie, made a bad choice. And that's explored in this book. It's also touched on in The Inheritance, which was his first kind of appearance. And he's kind of been trying to make amends for that ever since, trying to live with that ever since. And Jack's got a particularly cynical outlook because he exists in a world of criminality. And so in Jack's worldview, I think he almost has to believe that if you step into the world of crime and you cop a bullet to the head, you have that coming. That's just the deal you make. That the moment you're in that world, live by the sword, die by the sword kind of thing. And so basically in that passage in High Rise, I want to expand it a little bit to a less hardline and more sort of humanistic standpoint where it says something to the effect of like, if you die peacefully at age 90, surrounded by your family and friends and loved ones, you've probably done something right. But, if you die in a car accident when you've had 30 beers and you careen off the road or something, well, I mean, what did you think was going to happen? And likewise, if you get gunned down at 30 because you've joined a gang and you've lived this violent life, then also what do you think is going to happen? Basically, it sort of explores the ways in which our choices do affect our endings and the ways in which we live affect the ways in which we die. Now, again, just to really reiterate, clearly that's not always the case. In many, many cases, it's not. But I did think it was, I guess, a reflection that suited Jack really well, that it kind of speaks to his worldview and speaks to his moral code and speaks to how he justifies a lot of his own actions. And I think Jack is somebody who, and this is the other character who is often Jack's foil across these books is Maggie, who appears in this book as well. And she's the protagonist of several of my books. And, I'm writing a book at the moment that will sort of serve as her finale and her goodbye. And she's got a line in the minor spoiler alert, in the book that I'm working on at the moment, where she sort of reflects on the fact that she a long time ago accepted that she could die at any minute in the most violent way possible. And she's like, well, this is just the consequence of the choices I've made. And I think Jack has a similar perspective. I think Jack does have a similar perspective of being like, well, I made this mistake when I was younger. I am damned. And if I die here, I die here, and that's on me. But God help me, I'm going to do as much good as I can before I go.
You mentioned earlier a flamethrower. I must admit, I was a little bit impressed, I guess, with the array of weapons that were described in this book and the weapons in the different hands of the different people that arrive in all of these scenes. So was there any kind of notable research you undertook before or during the course of writing this book in regards to weapons?
Not overly. Like, I mean, I'm not like the truth. I mean, yeah, I grew up in the country, so I've been around guns a little bit here and there, but not in any like significant sense. I've never fired a gun in my life. I've been criticized for this, by the way. I've been criticized for not naming the brands of the guns or following the types of bullets or any of that stuff. And I understand that to some degree, but I mean, I also kind of feel like Jack and Maggie don't really care. I don't feel like these are characters who are going to obsess over everything. I mean, Maggie in particular is a character who just picks up whatever weapon is to hand, and she doesn't care whether it's a Glock or a Sig Sauer or anything like that. She's just going to be like, gun, cool, go bang, bad guy dead, sweet. Whereas Jack, I just don't think cares that much or is all that interested. So, I mean, yeah, I did some research into, how many shots a gun would have and everything. The flamethrower, it was a bit harder to do research into because I know they do technically exist. I just haven't come across one in my life, and I don't expect I ever will. But I think my way of looking at this was a bit more like I decided a long time ago that these thrillers that I'm writing, from The Hunter to The Inheritance to The Hitchhiker, The Caretaker, High Rise, The Lodger on Audible, The Consequence on Audible, and The Reckoning for next year, these are books that take place in a slightly heightened world. These are books that are designed to be roller coaster rides. These are books that you're not supposed to take 100% seriously, which isn't to say that there isn't depth or weight or meaning to them, because I think there has to be. And I think the characters do have to be grounded in something human and real and raw and tender. But when it comes to the action side of it, when it comes to the criminal side of it, I don't want to bury this too much in exactly how this would play out in reality, because the reality is this situation wouldn't play out in reality. Nobody's sneaking a flamethrower into a building like this in real life. I think the police raid would be handled very differently in real life. I think the reward would be handled very differently in real life. There's all of those things to bear in mind. But the truth of it is, I don't think you get a book like this. I don't think you get to have this kind of fun if you fixate too much on the minutiae of how it would all play out if it was a real situation. And I take the criticisms of people saying that you're not doing your due diligence and you should look into all of that stuff, and I raise you the entire John Wick franchise. Like, are we really gonna? I mean, look, this is not as heightened a world as John Wick, but John Wick takes place in a world where every second person in New York is just an assassin. and they have their own designated hotel and their own designated currency and their own designated underground culture. This is ridiculous, but it's also so much fun. And in these books, I try to split the difference between that same level of heightened pulpy fun, but also some heart and some depth and some character development and some meaning, you know?
Aspiring authors out there could take note of that, because I think often we do obsess over those details and think we have to get everything absolutely right because there's going to be that person waiting in the wings to send you an email and tell you that you got it wrong.
Oh man, I remember I got one for The Hunted once where like somebody was saying, "Oh, great book, love the book," but and there's a scene in The Hunted where the roadhouse explodes. I mean, spoiler alert, but it came out 5 years ago, and there's a scene where anyway, and I came up with what I thought was a really cool way to make the roadhouse explode, and it's something that the main characters do to save themselves at a key point. And there was this response I got where it was like, "Oh, great book, love the book, everything, characters are awesome and everything." And then about 3 paragraphs of explaining how a roadhouse just would not explode that way in real life. And I mean, at that, you just kind of have to sit there and go, yeah, look, I'm not saying that, like, I think it's a good thing to completely discard all sense of reality because you do ultimately have to be able to suspend your disbelief, and suspend disbelief becomes extremely hard if the entire book takes place in a place of disbelief. You do have to somehow be able to just go with it. But in the case of the Roadhouse explosion thing, I just kind of found myself thinking, yeah, but how many people know that? Like how many people are going to think about it that way? And you can also, if you really need to, you can explain it away by saying, look, it's an old roadhouse. It probably functions differently. It's run down. It's not well maintained. The safety mechanisms probably aren't all up to scratch and everything. Like I think as long as you can kind of figure it out with just those slight head leaps, I think it's okay. Maybe I'm wrong, but I'm not writing realism, and I don't at this stage intend to write realism.
Gabe, you've clocked up some impressive credentials in your writing career. You've won the prestigious Sir Peter Ustinov Television Scriptwriting Award in 2015. You were nominated for the 2017 Kenneth Branagh Award for New Drama Writing. Your first novel for adults, published in 2020, which you mentioned earlier, became a bestseller, and a film adaptation is currently in development. And you've published 2 more thrillers, which you've mentioned, The Inheritance and The Caretaker, along with a YA novel and a middle grade adventure novel. So I guess it begs the question, did you always want to be an author? And how did that first come about?
Yeah, look, I think I knew I wanted to be an author from when I was a child, basically, because I just knew that there was nothing in my life or in the world that made me as excited as stories did. Nothing that I was as passionate about as whether it was a book or a film or whatever it might be. And so, of course, then your big challenge becomes, how do you realize that reality? And the very short version of how I realized that reality was, very short version of a very long story, was that I basically had this novel that I wrote in high school, and I spent about 10 years trying to get it published. And I rewrote it and I rewrote it and I adapted it into a play that became my first play and gave me this sort of playwriting side hustle for a while, which ended up being leading to the Pact and leading to High Rise, actually, if you want to look at it in that really holistic sense. But then also that was the same story that I adapted into my screenplay that won the Ustinov Award in 2015, which is the thing that really started my career and really sort of, put me on the map and everything. But that book was a very different project. That book was much more of a literary novel, like a sprawling saga of human failures and mistakes and everything. And, in my mind, it was the great Australian novel. And I just spent years and years and years trying to get that over the line. And then it was finally just this moment where, like, I think I'd gotten it as good as I possibly could. And my now agent read it and said, look, it just doesn't work for one reason or another. Do you have any other ideas? And I was kind of desperate and broke, and my career had gone nowhere. And I was quite disheartened by the fact that I put everything I had into this one book. And clearly that one book wasn't enough. And I just sort of wrote The Hunted in this moment of just complete, what else have I got to lose? And I was always a horror fan growing up. So I thought, I'm just going to write this completely ridiculous, over the top, savage, outback horror novel. And that was the thing that started my career. I wrote the book in 2 months. And then suddenly, it's a top 10 bestseller. Suddenly, the film adaptations start shooting in the next year. Like, it's taken a while to get to that point, but it's underway finally. And, it got published in, I think, like 13 languages or something. It's led to these other books that aren't necessarily sequels, but are all set in the same world and crossover characters and everything. Maggie, the protagonist of The Hunted, is in High Rise and then will be in The Reckoning next year, which will end her story, as I said before. Like, it's still staggering to me that like gnarly little outback Ozploitation indulgence that is such a, compared to the thing that I spent 10 years like agonizing over thinking this would be my literary masterpiece, the fact that The Hunted was the thing that broke through is still so surprising to me. And yet I love it. I love the fact that it was that book. And I think that it just speaks to the fact that my heart has always been with genre. And I've been lucky enough that the success of The Hunted and the subsequent books has allowed me to explore other things. I got to do The True Color of Little White Lie, which was a coming of age comedy YA novel that is fair, more than a little autobiographical. But then I've also gotten to do my Andromache Peters books, which, are middle grade adventure books about a girl trying to save her dad from a parallel universe. And I love those books. And I feel like I get to indulge a very different side of my personality in those books. I get to have fun with, adventure and quasi sci-fi and everything. The thrillers might be the bread and butter, but I do get to do a lot of other stuff because of them. So, like any author, my journey hasn't been conventional because nobody's is conventional. But yeah, I still to this day look back and I go, this wasn't the kind of writer I was trying to be, but it's the kind of writer I'm very happy that I get to be, because I think in the end, it feels a lot more true to the sensibilities that I always had growing up, the horror films I loved and the adventure stories I loved and everything. And now I kind of get to tell my own. So how good's that?
You mentioned that the film adaptation is sort of progressing along. Is there anything you can tell us more about that?
There was a big announcement last year of the cast, including, Ben Mendelsohn, Toby Wallace, Abby Lee, Eliza Scanlon, Shane Jacobson, Daniel Henshall. It's actually insane when you lay out like the who's who of Australian actors that are in this movie. It's directed by John Michael McDonough, who, I mean, this is the part that I think blows my mind almost the most because John Michael McDonough is one of my heroes. When he had his film Calvary with Brendan Gleeson out in 2014, I went to a special screening at Nova that he did and got him to sign my Blu-ray of The Guard, his first film also with Brendan Gleeson. I was so nervous. So, when I got the email saying that he was interested in taking it on, I screamed, I lost my mind. But yeah, look, basically, it's taken a little bit longer. A few things got in the way, like the writer's strike was a bit of a problem that held things back a little bit. It was supposed to shoot early this year. It's got pushed back for a couple of reasons. But the main thing at this point is I know when it's filming. It's not public knowledge yet, so I don't want to sort of announce that because I don't want to get in trouble. But the main thing that is public knowledge is that it's fully financed. Like it's got all the monies there. It's had some really generous funding from Screen Australia, from Screen New South Wales. The money's all in place. It's filming in Broken Hill. The cast's all in place. Everything's lined up. I've seen it sort of stop and start so many times over the years that I'm just a bit reluctant to, loudly pop too much champagne because as anybody who's been in film knows, things can fall over at any second, and I truly hope that doesn't. But at this point, look, it is as close to happening as it's ever been, close to happening to the point where filming dates are locked in, schedules are being lined up and everything. It's pretty much ready to go, just depending on the scheduling some of the actors and stuff. And all I can say is that I'm just yeah, extremely excited to see what happens with it. So watch this space.
Absolutely. That sounds very exciting indeed. Now, Gabe, you might know that there are a lot of aspiring authors and writers who listen to this podcast. And so, with that in mind and all of your experience to date, could you offer any tips for anyone trying to get published or finish that first manuscript?
Yeah, it's just a couple. One's a practical one and one's a slightly more esoteric one, perhaps. The practical one that I always say, because I don't think enough people say it, is that I really do recommend that you write theatre. If you haven't considered it before, I think that there is a problem that a lot of young writers have, which is that they decide they want to be a screenwriter or a novelist or a playwright, very rarely a playwright because it's the least sexy of them all. But I mean, none of them are sexy as anybody who's actually, lived through this knows. But the thing about theatre is, I never wanted to be a playwright when I was younger. I wanted to write books. And I ended up doing my education in screenwriting. I studied screenwriting, which taught me a lot about story structure. But I learned so much on the ground writing independent plays. And the reason I suggest writing theatre is because it's cheap to produce relatively. You can kind of perform it anywhere. You can perform it in rooms above a pub. There are always little black box theatres that are very affordable or will do a deal with you where they split the profits at the end. You have to pay anything up front. And ultimately, all you need is a script, willing actors, and a willing director. And you can get in there, you can invite reviewers, and you can sort of learn firsthand what works and what doesn't work. And what I mean by that is there is a baptism of fire thing in theatre where if you're sitting in a room and a joke that you've written doesn't land or a twist doesn't get a reaction, you will know. You will know because when people don't laugh at your funny lines, that's like a slap to the face. When people don't gasp at your big twists, that sucks. When people sit and fall asleep in your plays, when they yawn, when they whisper to each other, when they get up and walk out, all of which has happened to me, it's a really, really tough thing to witness when you're sitting in the room watching all this unfold. But you also see the moments where they gasp and they lean in and they react and they get excited and they laugh. And you learn so quickly what works and what doesn't work from that experience. I learned so much from doing theater. And also it does help you build a platform. It does help you get your name out there. If you get a few good reviews, I mean, you get a few good reviews in like major newspapers or something, which can happen. It's hard, but it can happen. Then it's a really, really good way to sort of get your name out there and sort of make yourself more on the radar of the players you might want to try to get to eventually. So that's one thing. The other thing that I would just say as well is that I just don't believe there's any point in being any other writer than you want to be. I see so many writers, and I've been one of them, who've tried to write more, I guess, literary work or more artistic kind of work or more, politically charged work. And if that's not where your heart is at, then readers will see through that. There is no point in being any writer other than the writer you want to be. And that might sound like it's at odds with what I'm saying about writing theater, but the thing is, theater is a medium. It's not a genre. You can write any genre. Like I wrote comedies in theater. I wrote sci-fi action stories in theater. I wrote dramas. I wrote thrillers. You can do any kind of genre in there. It's just the fact that it's being acted out on stage by actors, basically. And so what I would say is if your heart is in sort of more pulpy genre stories like mine tends to be, then write that. Don't write what you think people are going to buy. Don't write what you think publishers are interested in, because that's ultimately just fake and you're never going to get it published anyway. And even if you do, what will end up happening is that you get stuck writing books that you don't want to write and that you don't actually invest in. And if that's the case, then what's the point of being an author at all? So that would be my thing. Just it sounds really kind of, Hallmark card. Be true to yourself. But I mean, there's cliches are cliches for a reason. I think this one absolutely is.
Gabe, a final word on the book. If there was one thing that you would like readers to take away, what would it be?
Oh man, great question. No, look, if there's one thing I'd like you to take away, it's that if you're interested, look, I think High Rise is a huge amount of fun. Look, I'm really, really proud of it. I think it's a great, fun action story. But at the same time, I know that, once as an author you get to a certain point in your career where you've written a bunch of different books, and particularly books like mine that do interconnect, and it's relatively public knowledge they interconnect, I think there can be a bit of a question as to where do I start? Or, what if I don't want to read The Hunted because I don't really like horror? Or what if, I'm not really interested in The Caretaker because it sounds too creepy or anything like that? And to which I would say, these books are not books where you have to read every single one of them to get the whole picture. They're not. They're not designed that way. They never have been. They're standalone books. But I would also say that if you are interested in checking out my work, I think High Rise is a great starting point. I think High Rise, it introduces some of the players who turn up in other books and everything. I think it's reasonably accessible. It's not a creepy horror novel. It's really just like a barnstorming, balls to the wall action story that I think anybody who, enjoys a bit of pulse pounding adrenaline can get a kick out of. And if you do want to go on beyond that and check out the other books and see how it all connects and what the jigsaw puzzle is, then, absolutely, I think it's a great place to do that from. But if you don't, you just want to have a really fun action story, then it's got you covered on that front as well. So to anyone listening who wants to check it out, I really hope you like the book.
That's wonderful. That's a perfect note on which to wrap up this discussion. And Gabe, as I said, I couldn't have loved this book more. I wish you every success with it. And thank you so very much for joining me on Talking Aussie Books today.
Thanks so much for having me.
That's it for this episode, folks. Hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as I did. If so, I'd love it if you'd leave a review on your preferred listening platform, which may include Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or Amazon Music. Until next time, friends, happy reading.